Christopher Columbus died screaming in agony, his body consumed by a mysterious illness that baffled every doctor who examined him. For centuries, historians blamed a common disease. But recent discoveries reveal something far more sinister. The man who claimed to discover America carried secrets darker than any ocean he crossed. His journals hide confessions that would shock the world. His crew whispered stories they were forbidden to tell. And the truth about his final days reveals a pattern of choices that destroyed everything he touched. This is the real story they never taught you in school. Genoa, 1451. A wool weaver's son watched merchant ships leave the harbor and dreamed of something bigger. Domenico Colombo expected his boy to follow the family trade, but young Christopher had different plans. By his early 20s, he was already working for Genoa's wealthiest trading families. He learned navigation, studied maps, and built connections across Europe. He wasn't just learning a trade, he was studying power. How to get it, how to keep it, how to use it. Every voyage taught him one lesson: the ruthless win, the gentle lose, and he refused to lose. 1479 brought Christopher his first major opportunity. Philippa Manasper Estrella wasn't beautiful. She wasn't young by the standards of the time. At around 25, most considered her past marriageable age. Her widowed mother struggled financially, but Philippa had something Christopher desperately needed. Her late father had been a Portuguese knight with direct connections to Prince John and Prince Henry T. He navigator. Christopher saw the opportunity immediately. He courted her, married her, and gained access to nobility he could never reach as a merchant's son. She gave him a son named Diego within their first year together, but Christopher wasn't interested in family life. He was interested in what her family could give him. And once he had those connections secured, he was already planning his next move. Christopher spent the next several years trading along Africa's western coast. He traveled as far south as present-day Ghana, buying and selling goods for profit. His wife Philippa stayed behind with their young son. She was barely 30 years old when she died. No one recorded the cause. Christopher returned to find her gone. He settled her estate quickly, collected what money remained, and took custody of Diego. Within months, he was already pursuing his next venture. Some men grieve. Christopher planned. Europe's wealth flowed from the east along the Silk Road. Spices, silk, and gold came overland through dangerous territory controlled by the Ottoman Empire. Recent Portuguese expeditions were finding sea routes around Africa to reach Asia. But Christopher believed he had a better idea. Sail west across the Atlantic, reach Asia from the opposite direction, cut out all the middlemen, control the entire trade route. His obsession went deeper than simple profit. He wrote constantly about gold, not as currency, but as a holy mission. He believed massive amounts of gold would fund a crusade to reclaim Jerusalem. He dreamed of converting every person on earth to Christianity. In his mind, sailing west would accomplish both goals: unlimited wealth and limited converts. All he needed was someone willing to fund the voyage, and he was willing to lie to get it. Christopher needed a proposal convincing enough to secure royal funding. This is where he made his biggest error. Contrary to popular myth, educated Europeans already knew Earth was round. Greek scholars had calculated Earth's size with reasonable accuracy over 1,000 years earlier. But Christopher rejected the correct measurements. He cherry-picked theories that made Earth seem smaller, much smaller. In his proposals, he underestimated Earth's circumference by nearly 1/3. When he presented his plan to King John II of Portugal, the king's advisors immediately spotted the problem. The math was wrong, obviously wrong. They knew the true distance to Asia heading west would be impossible for any ship of that era to survive. They rejected him. He tried other courts. England said no. France said no. Every educated committee who reviewed his proposal recognized it as fantasy, but Christopher kept pushing. Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile reviewed Christopher's proposal in 1486. Their committee dismissed it just like all the others, but the monarchs made an unusual decision. They gave Christopher a small allowance to keep him available. They didn't believe his math. They just didn't want another kingdom getting lucky if by some miracle he was right. Christopher took the money and waited. He spent years on this royal retainer, living in Cordoba, networking with court officials, and looking for any advantage he could find during his time in Cordoba. Christopher met Beatriz Enriquez de Arana. She was 20 years old and orphaned. He was in his mid-30s, technically still married in the eyes of the church since Felipa had died. Canon law was complicated. Christopher didn't care. He took Beatriz as his mistress. Within a year, she gave birth to his second son. Christopher had a choice to make: acknowledge the child or abandon them both. He acknowledged the baby. Then he named him Fernando, not after a relative, not after a saint, after King Ferdinand himself. The message was clear. Christopher was loyal. He honored the king. He deserved royal support. It was a calculated move, using his own infant son as a political tool. January 1492 changed everything. Ferdinand and Isabella had just conquered Granada, the last Muslim stronghold in Iberia. The victory ended centuries of conflict. The monarchs were celebrating. They had money to spend. They wanted to prove Spain's dominance over Portugal and other European powers. Christopher approached them again with his Western proposal. This time, they agreed. The contract they signed was extraordinary. If Christopher succeeded in finding a western route to Asia, he would become governor of any land Spain claimed. He would receive 10% of all revenues from those territories. He would hold these titles for life and pass them to his heirs. The deal made Christopher potentially one of the wealthiest men in Europe. All he had to do was survive the voyage and find something valuable. On August 3rd, he departed Spain with 3 ships. 5 weeks into the voyage, Christopher's crew was ready to mutiny. They'd sailed farther west than any European expedition on record. No land appeared. Supplies were running low. The crew demanded they turn back. Christopher convinced them to continue just 3 more days. On October 12, 1492, a lookout spotted land. They'd reached an island in the Bahamas. Christopher named it San Salvador when he met the Lucayan, Taino, and Arawak peoples living there. He immediately noted they would make excellent servants. They wore small gold ornaments. Christopher demanded they show him where the gold came from. He was convinced he'd reached islands near Asia. He called the indigenous people Indians and would insist on this name for the rest of his life, even as evidence mounted that he'd found something completely different. He didn't care about geography. He cared about gold. Christopher spent months exploring various Caribbean islands. He traded with some indigenous groups. He captured others as prisoners. On Hispaniola, he left about 40 men to build a fort and establish a Spanish presence. Then he began the journey back to Spain. The voyage home nearly killed him. A massive storm struck the fleet just before reaching Spain. During the chaos, Christopher suffered his first attack of what he believed was gout. The pain was excruciating. It left him barely able to move. He would suffer similar attacks for the rest of his life, each one worse than the last. But at that moment, he just wanted to reach Spain alive. He survived, and Ferdinand and Isabella greeted him as a hero. March 1493, Barcelona welcomed Christopher with celebrations usually reserved for military victories. He presented Ferdinand and Isabella with gold, exotic birds, and usual plants, and 6 indigenous people he'd captured as slaves. The monarchs were impressed enough to fund a second voyage. Just 6 months after returning to Spain, Christopher was heading back across the Atlantic, this time with 17 ships and over 1,200 men. This wasn't an exploration mission. This was a colonization fleet. Christopher returned to Hispaniola expecting to find his fort thriving. Instead, he found ruins. Every man was dead. Local chiefs told him what happened. The Spanish settlers had terrorized the indigenous population. They'd stolen food. They'd kidnapped women. They'd enslaved men to search for gold. Eventually, a chief named Caonabo had enough. He led an attack, burned the fort, and killed everyone inside. Christopher didn't see this as a consequence of Spanish brutality. He saw it as rebellion that needed crushing. While he went exploring Cuba, he left men in charge of Hispaniola with orders to establish complete Spanish control by any means necessary. when he returned for months later. The island had descended into chaos. His representatives had enslaved hundreds of indigenous people. They'd taken women and girls for their own use, some as young as 9 or 10 years old. The indigenous population had risen up in response. Open warfare had erupted. Christopher didn't restore order. He escalated the violence. He personally participated in distributing indigenous women to his men as rewards. He implemented a tribute system requiring every indigenous person over 14 to deliver a certain quantity of gold dust every 3 months. Those who failed had their hands cut off. He ordered mass executions to terrify the population into submission. When Spanish settlers criticized him or his brothers, he responded with equal cruelty. He had one woman's tongue cut out for speaking against his family. He ordered a man's nose and ears removed for stealing corn. He wasn't governing. He was ruling through terror. But word of his methods was spreading. Letters reached Spain describing the atrocities. Ferdinand and Isabella began receiving complaints from colonists who expected to get rich but instead found themselves trapped on an island ruled by a tyrant. Christopher returned to Spain in March 1496. He brought gold and more enslaved indigenous people, despite growing concerns about his methods. He was still treated relatively well, but his health was deteriorating rapidly. Since that first attack during the storm, his symptoms had multiplied. He suffered repeated bouts of fever. His eyes bled. He experienced periods of blindness that lasted for days. His joints swelled with excruciating pain. Doctors examined him repeatedly. They agreed he had gout, a disease common among wealthy men who ate rich foods and drank heavily. But some of his symptoms didn't match. The problems especially seemed unusual. Christopher didn't care what caused it. He just wanted it to stop. May 1498, Christopher crossed the Atlantic for a third time. He was determined to restore order in Hispaniola and find the massive gold deposits he'd promised Ferdinand and Isabella. Instead, he found the situation worse than ever. Now it wasn't just indigenous people rebelling. Spanish colonists were rising up against Christopher's rule. They'd been promised wealth and found only hard labor and danger. Some tried to leave. Christopher had them arrested and executed for desertion. He hanged at least one rebel leader publicly. The situation spiraled out of control. Christopher sent desperate letters to Spain begging for help. He asked Ferdinand and Isabella to send a royal commissioner to assist with governing the colony. The monarchs agreed, but they weren't sending help. They were sending an investigator. Francisco de Bobadilla arrived in August 1500 with full authority to examine how Christopher was running the colony. He interviewed witnesses. He reviewed records. He inspected evidence. Everything confirmed the reports. Christopher had been ruling through torture, executions, and enslavement. Bobadilla arrested Christopher, seized his property, and declared himself the new governor. October 1500, Christopher Columbus, the great explorer, the admiral of the ocean sea, sat in chains in the hold of a ship bound for Spain. He'd spent 6 weeks imprisoned, accused of tyranny, torture, and incompetence. When he finally stood before Ferdinand and Isabella at their palace in Granada, he defended every action. He blamed the colonists. He blamed the indigenous people. He blamed Bobadilla for exceeding his authority. Remarkably, the monarchs believed him, or at least, they chose to support him over Bobadilla. They recalled the investigator. They restored Christopher's wealth, and incredibly, they agreed to fund a fourth voyage. Christopher had talked his way out of justice. May 1502. Christopher's fourth voyage was cursed from the start. Storms battered his ships continuously. His health deteriorated further. The problems and joint pain grew worse with each passing week. By June 1503, his fleet was so damaged they couldn't continue. The ships washed up on Jamaica's coast. They were stranded. Christopher sent 2 men paddling a canoe to Hispaniola to request rescue. The new governor, Nicolas d'Ovando, hated Christopher. He'd heard all the stories about Christopher's brutal rule. He saw an opportunity for revenge. He delayed sending help. Months passed. Christopher and his crew remained trapped on Jamaica with dwindling supplies. Christopher used his knowledge of astronomy to predict a lunar eclipse. impressing the local indigenous people enough that they continued providing food. He'd been stranded for a full year before rescue finally arrived in June 1504. He gave up. He sailed back to Spain and arrived in November. Then he learned about the final betrayal, King Ferdinand, and refused to honor their contract. He claimed that since Christopher had been removed as governor, he wasn't entitled to the 10% of colonial revenues. Christopher was furious. He'd risked everything. He'd crossed the ocean 4 times. He'd endured storms, attacks, illness, and imprisonment, and now the crown was stealing what they'd promised. He spent his remaining energy writing letters, demanding justice, pleading his case. No one listened. His health continued failing. The pain in his joints became constant. The eye problems left him nearly blind. He could barely walk. Every day brought more agony. May 20th, 1506, Christopher Columbus died in Valladolid, Spain. He was 54 years old. His body had been failing for over a decade. The final months were unbearable. He died believing he'd reached Asia. He died thinking he'd been cheated out of his rightful wealth. He died largely forgotten by the world he'd changed forever. For centuries, historians accepted the contemporary diagnosis, gout, a rich man's disease caused by excessive eating and drinking. But modern medical experts who've studied his symptoms believe something different. The combination of joint pain, eye bleeding, and other symptoms suggests reactive arthritis. This condition can be triggered by bacterial infections. One researcher believes Christopher contracted it from food poisoning during one of his voyages. Poor sanitation, spoiled food, contaminated water, and disease born from the same conditions that killed so many sailors. Christopher Columbus changed the world, but for centuries after his death, Europe largely forgot him. He hadn't reached Asia. He hadn't found the unlimited gold he'd promised. His governorship had been a disaster. His calculations had been wrong. Other explorers received more recognition. But history had one final irony in store. We now know Christopher wasn't even the first European to reach the Americas. Norse explorer Leif Erikson and his crew had landed in North America roughly 500 years before Christopher was born. The great discoverer hadn't discovered anything